Subscribe our channel for more videos.
In September 1943, Japan's greatest fighter pilot sat in a briefing tent on New Britain and laughed. They passed around an intelligence report describing America's newest fighter plane. They laughed at its weight. They laughed at its size. They laughed at what they called another American failure to understand the art of aerial combat. 30 days later, that laughter began to die. And within 6 months, the men who had been laughing were writing their final letters home, because every Japanese pilot in the Pacific had learned the same terrifying truth. When you heard the sound of a Hellcat's engine, the mathematics of your survival had already been calculated, and the answer was almost always the same. This is the story of how the most dominant fighter force in the world destroyed itself by misunderstanding a single aircraft. This is the story of the F6F Hellcat, and it is one of the most devastating reversals of fortune in the entire history of warfare. To understand what the Hellcat meant to Japan, you first have to understand what the Zero meant to Japan, not just as an aircraft, but as a religion. When the Mitsubishi A6M-0 first swept across the Pacific skies on December 7, 1941, it did not just attack a naval base, it shattered every assumption Western aviation had built about fighter design. The Zero was not simply a good airplane, it was something that by the physics of the era should not have been possible. A fighter with the range of a heavy bomber, the agility of a pre-war biplane, and enough firepower to destroy anything it could catch. When American engineers finally got their hands on a captured example in 1942, several of them initially refused to accept the performance data. They thought their instruments were malfunctioning. They ran the tests again. The results were the same. The secret behind the Zero's miraculous performance was a philosophy of design so radical it bordered on reckless. Mitsubishi's engineers, led by the brilliant Jiro Horikoshi, had made a decision that would define Japanese aviation for the entire war. They chose performance over protection, completely, totally, without compromise. The Zero was constructed from a classified aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin that created an airframe 30% lighter than comparable American designs. There was no armor plating behind the pilot's seat. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks. The radio was frequently removed entirely to shave off a few more pounds. Every single ounce that could be eliminated was eliminated, because every ounce saved translated directly into speed, into climb rate, into the breathtaking maneuverability that would become Japan's most devastating weapon. And it worked. God help everyone in its path, it worked. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese lost 29 aircraft and destroyed 347. In the Philippines, 7 losses against 103 destroyed. Over Darwin, Australia, 2 Zeros lost against 30 Allied aircraft annihilated. The British Far East Fleet's air arm was gutted in days. The Dutch East Indies Air Force ceased to exist within a week. Across an ocean-sized battlefield, stretching from Burma to the Coral Sea, the Zero reigned with an authority that seemed almost supernatural. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who would become Japan's highest-scoring ace with 87 confirmed kills, described flying the Zero in his recovered diary with an almost spiritual reverence. He wrote that the aircraft responded to thought rather than just control input. He wrote that American planes flew like trucks, heavy and clumsy, built like cars rather than weapons. He wasn't wrong. In 1941 and early 1942, he wasn't wrong at all. The pilots who flew the Zero in those first thunderous months of the Pacific War were not ordinary men. They were the products of the most demanding aviation training program in the world. Japanese naval pilots entering combat in 1941 had a minimum of 700 flight hours behind them, 700 hours of aerobatics, gunnery, formation flying, navigation, and the deeply ingrained spiritual philosophy of aerial combat that treated a dogfight as something closer to a duel of honor than a military engagement. These men had been forged over years into the finest individual combat aviators the world had ever seen, and they knew it. They had proved it over and over across thousands of Pacific sky. So when intelligence reports about a new fighter began arriving in early 1943, nobody in Japanese naval aviation was particularly worried. The first reports came through neutral Swedish diplomatic channels and described an aircraft called the F6F Hellcat, produced by the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation on Long Island, New York City. The specifications landed on the desk of Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had personally planned the Pearl Harbor attack and one of the sharpest aviation minds in the Imperial Naval Forces. Genda studied the numbers, he reviewed them carefully, and then he wrote an analysis, preserved to this day in the Japanese Defense Archives, that would become one of the most catastrophically wrong assessments in military history. He wrote that the Americans had learned nothing. He wrote that the Hellcat represented a continuation of their failed philosophy, attempting to overcome pilot skill with weight of machinery. He concluded that a Zero would fly circles around it. Looking at the raw numbers, his logic was impeccable. The Hellcat weighed 12,186 pounds fully loaded. The Zero weighed 5,800 pounds. The Hellcat's wing loading of 36.5 pounds per square foot suggested a turning radius exceeding 900 feet in a sustained turn. The Zero's wing loading of 22 pounds per square foot gave it a turning radius of just 612 feet. In a turning dogfight, which was the entire basis of Japanese fighter tactics, a Zero would run circles inside a Hellcat's turn, get on its tail, and kill it. The mathematics seemed airtight. Japanese pilots who reviewed the same data came to the same conclusion and reacted the same way. They laughed. What Captain Genda and every pilot laughing in that briefing tent had failed to understand was something fundamental, something that would cost Japan an entire generation of aviators before the lesson finally sunk in. They had confused the rules of the game with the game itself. They had assumed that because the Zero had been designed to fight a certain kind of air battle, all future air battles would be fought that way. They had looked at the Hellcat's specifications through the lens of tactics that were already becoming obsolete, and they had seen a fat, slow, clumsy target. They had not seen what Grumman's engineers had actually built.
Because the F6F Hellcat was not an attempt to beat the Zero at the Zero's game, it was an attempt to make the Zero's game completely irrelevant. And it had been designed with terrifying precision to do exactly that. The Hellcat's development had begun almost the moment American pilots started encountering Zeros over the Pacific and reporting back with equal parts fury and genuine fear. The message from the front was consistent and urgent. Whatever you're building next, make it faster in a climb, make it faster in a dive. Give it enough armor that it doesn't disintegrate when a Zero gets a single burst into it. Give it enough firepower that if we get one good shot, we don't need a second. The pilots who were fighting and dying against Zeros every day had identified exactly what they needed, and Grumman had listened with absolute seriousness. The result was an aircraft that looked almost brutish compared to the elegant Zero. The Hellcat was wide, it was heavy, its nose was dominated by the massive bulk of a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine, a piece of engineering that produced 2,000 horsepower at a time when the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine was producing 1,130. It sat on enormous undercarriage legs designed to absorb the crushing forces of carrier landings that would have torn a more delicate aircraft apart. 212 pounds of armor plate surrounded the pilot. The oil system was wrapped in 110 pounds of additional protection. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, able to absorb dozens of bullet holes and still function. The cockpit was sealed behind bulletproof glass. Every single thing that the Zero's designers had stripped away in pursuit of performance, Grumman had deliberately added back. And they had done it while still producing an aircraft that could reach 380 miles per hour in level flight and climb at 3,500 feet per minute. That climb rate, remember that number, it is the number that would begin killing Japanese pilots within weeks of the Hellcat entering combat. The first real warning came on September 30th, 1943, over Marcus Island, 800 miles northwest of Wake in the Central Pacific. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was flying Zero escort for a reconnaissance mission when he spotted them. 6 dark blue shapes climbing hard from the southeast. His first instinct, recorded faithfully in his after-action report, was that they were B-25 bombers on an unusual heading. Then they turned, and he saw the distinctive silhouette. Single engine, massive fuselage, wings that seemed almost too short for the heavy body behind them. Fukui rolled into the attack with complete confidence. Standard tactics: use the Zero's phenomenal turn rate to curve onto the enemy's tail, force them into a turning fight, and kill them at leisure. He had done it dozens of times against Wildcats, against P-40s, against Hurricanes. The procedure was so well established it was almost mechanical. What happened next was not mechanical at all. The Hellcat did not run. It did not attempt to turn with him. It went vertical. The Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp poured out its 2,000 horsepower in a nearly vertical climb that Fukui watched with something between confusion and the first cold touch of genuine alarm. He tried to follow. The Zero struggled. Its lighter engine, already breathing thin air, could not match the raw power being poured through the Hellcat's massive propeller. Fukui watched his airspeed decay as he fought gravity. And then, at 15,000 feet, the Hellcat performed a maneuver that by all the laws of physics as Japanese pilots understood them, simply should not have been possible for an aircraft of its weight. A hammerhead turn. Perfect, crisp, dropping the heavy fighter directly onto Fukui's tail with the mathematical precision of an executioner who has rehearsed the moment 1,000 times. Fukui had approximately 3 seconds to react before the American opened fire. He reported afterward that the volume of fire was unlike anything he had ever encountered. 6 50 caliber machine guns, not the 4 that intelligence had predicted. 17 hits in 3 seconds. He escaped only by rolling into a spin and letting the Zero fall away, bleeding fuel and hydraulic fluid, barely making it back to Marcus Island. His wingman, Petty Officer Second Class Maso, did not return. Neither did the reconnaissance aircraft they had been escorting. First blood to the Hellcat. Fukui's report landed on desks throughout Japanese Naval Aviation Command and was largely dismissed. One engagement proved nothing. The pilot made errors. The Americans had gotten lucky. The Zero was still the Zero. Then came Wake Island. On October 5, 1943, Task Force 14 struck Wake Island, and Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group to intercept. They climbed to 20,000 feet, found 12 Hellcats below them in perfect formation, and felt the hunter's satisfaction of altitude, position, and surprise all at once. Shiga wrote in his diary that victory had seemed certain. The engagement that followed did not feel like air combat. It felt like the dismantling of doctrine. As the Zeros dove on the Hellcats made something that violated every principle Japanese pilots had internalized through years of combat. They maintained formation and accelerated in a shallow dive that kept their energy reserves high. When the Zeros opened fire at extreme range, burning precious ammunition in hopes of lucky hits, the Hellcat simply absorbed the punishment. The armor plating that Japanese pilots had laughed about as excess weight now turned Zero machine gun rounds into something closer to annoyance than threat. The self-sealing tanks absorbed hits that would have turned an unprotected Zero into a fireball. Then the counterattack came. Not a turning dogfight, not a swirling melee. The Hellcats climbed, full power, straight up, using their massive engine reserves to reach altitudes where the Zero's engine began to starve for oxygen. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat was still producing 1,650 horsepower. The Zero had decayed to 900. The altitude advantage that the Japanese had started with had been systematically reversed in minutes, and now the Hellcats came down, not in graceful curves, in slashing, diving attacks that used their accumulated speed as a pure weapon. A burst of fire, a Zero destroyed, full power zoom climb back to altitude before the remaining Zeros could respond, and then again, and then again. 8 Zeros were shot down. No Hellcats were lost. Shiga's diary entry that night was a single devastating line. They came down on us like hawks on sparrows. Word began spreading through Japanese naval aviation with the particular speed of information that frightens people. Pilots traded accounts, compared notes, tried to find the tactical answer, the mistake that had been made, the correction that would restore the natural order of Pacific skies. They were looking for a solution inside a tactical framework that was already obsolete, and they didn't know it yet.
Lieutenant Commander Tao Tanemitsu knew it. With 32 aerial victories to his name and the distinction of being one of the very few pilots who had survived multiple encounters with Hellcats, Tanemitsu stood before the assembled pilots of the 204th Air Group at Rabaul in November 1943 and said something that none of them wanted to hear. He told them to forget everything they knew about air combat. He told them the Americans had changed the rules. He said the Hellcats fought like executioners, not warriors. What Tanemitsu had decoded through the painful education of surviving combats that should have killed him was the Hellcats' core tactical philosophy, a doctrine that American flight training schools had formalized and that Hellcat pilots had drilled until it was instinct: energy fighting. The principle was devastatingly simple: maintain speed, maintain altitude, never get slow, never get low. Make attacks from advantage, convert altitude into speed in a slashing pass, kill or damage your target, and use that excess speed to zoom climb back to altitude before the enemy can react. Refuse the turning fight absolutely. If a Zero tries to draw you into a turn, disengage, climb, reset, come back from a better angle. The Zero, with its lightweight and extraordinary maneuverability, was the most dangerous turning fighter in the world, so Hellcat pilots simply refused to turn with it. They took away the one weapon Japan's aviators knew how to use and replaced the dueling ground with a killing field, where Japanese pilot skill counted for almost nothing. Tanemitsu explained the worst part. The Hellcat's radio, the radio Japanese intelligence had noted as unnecessary extra weight, was the component that made the entire system work. While Japanese pilots flew as individual warriors, reading the battle with their own eyes and reacting with their own instincts, Hellcat pilots flew as components in a coordinated machine. They worked in pairs, one high, one low. While you engaged one, the other was already positioning for the kill. And hovering above the entire battle, invisible but omniscient, were the radar controllers aboard American warships who could see incoming Japanese formations from 50 miles away and vector Hellcats into perfect attacking positions before the Japanese pilots even knew they were threatened. Lieutenant Sadamu Kumachi described his first radar-directed interception with a horror that reads almost like an encounter with the supernatural. His flight was climbing through clouds when the Hellcats hit them. No warning, no visual contact, no warning of any kind. The Americans arrived diving from above, exactly on their heading, perfectly positioned with altitude advantage and the sun at their backs.
He wrote that it was like being blind men fighting those who could see in the dark. And the darkness was getting darker, because while Japanese aviation was fighting and dying and writing these anguished reports and struggling to find answers that didn't exist, the industrial machine that had produced the Hellcat was running at a pace that defied comprehension. At Grumman's factory in Bethpage, New York, shifts were running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers using color-coded instruction systems assembled complex subcomponents with a standardized precision that Japanese engineers would later describe as almost incomprehensible. Parts were interchangeable, quality held steady even as speed accelerated. At peak production, a new F6F Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every 60 minutes. Every 60 minutes, another aircraft with 2,000 horsepower, 650 caliber machine guns, and enough armor to shrug off what the Zero could throw at it, was born, checked, and readied for the long journey to the Pacific. Grumman produced 12,275 Hellcats in 30 months. In all of 1944, Japan's entire industrial complex produced 5,100 fighters of all types. America produced 35,000 fighters that year alone. The numbers were not just a gap, they were a chasm that was growing wider every single month, while Japan's experienced pilots died in Zeros over Wake Island and Rabaul and 100 other atolls scattered across the Pacific, and the replacement pilots arriving to fill their seats had received less and less training because there was less and less fuel for training and less time before the next emergency required them at the front. This is the part of the story that hits hardest if you sit with it for a moment. The Japanese pilot training program before the war had been extraordinary. 3 full years, 700 flight hours, every conceivable aspect of aerial combat taught until it was automatic. These men were artisans, they were warriors in the truest sense, and they were irreplaceable, because the pipeline that produced them took years and demanded resources that Japan simply could not regenerate fast enough. Every experienced pilot who died over a Hellcat represented a 3-year investment that Japan could not afford to repeat, and they were dying faster and faster. By early 1944, new Japanese naval pilots were arriving at the front with 300 flight hours. Army pilots were showing up with 200. Fuel shortages meant that much of that training had been conducted in gliders, not powered aircraft. Gunnery practice had been reduced to 50 rounds per pilot total for the entire training program. Formation flying had been eliminated from the curriculum. Instrument flying gone. Radio procedures abandoned. Everything that couldn't be taught without burning precious fuel was stripped away, and the resulting pilots were sent forward to face opponents who had trained for 300 hours minimum in their actual combat aircraft, had fired thousands of practice rounds, had practiced carrier landings until the procedure was as natural as breathing, and had internalized energy tactics through hundreds of training engagements over the skies of Texas and Florida. Lieutenant Sadamu Kumachi, training officer at Kasumigaura Naval Air Station, wrote a report in early 1944 that should have stopped hearts throughout Japanese Naval Command. He described an Ensign Yamamoto who had arrived at the front having never once fired his guns in flight because there was no ammunition for practice, having never flown at night because there was no fuel for such training. Ensign Yamamoto lasted 7 minutes in his first combat. 7 minutes. Against the Hellcat's grinding, methodical, radar-guided, coordinated destruction of anything Japanese aviation sent into the sky, 7 minutes was a lifetime for some. Then came the battle that ended the argument forever. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The Japanese Imperial Navy had rebuilt its carrier forces after the catastrophic losses at Midway 2 years earlier. 9 carriers, 450 aircraft, their best remaining pilots, the finest they had left. Operation Igo. The decisive battle that Japanese planners were absolutely certain would finally break American carrier power in the Pacific.
Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched his aircraft in 4 massive waves, each one tasked with destroying the American fleet before the American fighters could respond.
He had done his calculations. He believed in his pilots. He launched the first wave of 69 aircraft at 0830 and watched them disappear over the horizon toward the American task force. American radar detected them at 150 miles. 80 miles away, Hellcats were already climbing, already being vectored by shipboard radar controllers into perfect attacking positions. Altitude advantage established, sun position chosen. The Japanese formation's blind spots identified and exploited before a single Japanese pilot knew the interception was coming. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the fighter escort for the first wave, saw the Hellcats several minutes before the engagement began, and what he saw made his blood go cold. They were stacked from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, at least 60 of them, waiting above him like a steel curtain. His formation was at 18,000 feet. Every advantage was theirs. The first engagement lasted 12 minutes. Of 69 Japanese aircraft in the first wave, 42 were shot down. Not damaged, not forced to divert, shot down. Commander David McCampbell, CAG of Air Group 15 aboard USS Essex, shot down 7 aircraft that single day. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, got 6. McCampbell's after-action report was almost clinical in its description. The Japanese pilots tried to turn with the Hellcats. The Hellcats refused. High side run, fire, kill, zoom climb back to altitude. The Zero pilots would try to follow the climbing Hellcats, and as their airspeed bled off and they began to stall, another Hellcat would arrive from a different angle. It was not improvised, it was not lucky, it was a system performing exactly as designed. The second wave came and was destroyed. The third wave came and was destroyed. The fourth wave came, and what was left of it was destroyed. By the time the sun went down on June 19, 1944, the Japanese Navy had lost 346 carrier aircraft and another 50 land-based aircraft. American losses across the entire day's fighting totaled 30 aircraft from all causes, including operational accidents. 346 against 30. American pilots sitting in their ready rooms that evening, listening to the battle reports come in over squadron radios, reached for a metaphor to describe what had just happened. They remembered the stories their fathers had told about shooting game birds, about days when the sky was so thick with birds that missing felt like an accomplishment. Someone said it first. Someone called it a turkey shoot, and the name stuck, spreading across Task Force 58 overnight, reaching newspapers and radio broadcasts within days. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that said everything and nothing at the same time, because turkey shoots are not battles. They are not even contests. They are simply the systematic harvest of creatures that cannot escape. Japan's naval aviators had become the turkeys. But the worst single day was still 4 months away. October 24, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, the desperate last gamble of a Japanese Navy that knew by now that it was losing the war but could not bring itself to accept the mathematics of that reality. Commander David McCampbell led 7 Hellcats from USS Essex and intercepted a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft inbound toward the American fleet, 60 against 7. The math seemed insane even by the standards of what had already happened in this war. The engagement lasted 90 minutes. McCampbell shot down 9 aircraft, 5 Zeros, 4 bombers. Roy Rushing, his wingman, destroyed 6 more. The 7 Hellcats between them destroyed 15 Japanese aircraft without losing a single aircraft of their own, and routed a formation 8 times their number. McCampbell landed back on Essex and reported that the Hellcat had performed flawlessly throughout. He noted that he had not taken a single hit, despite being outnumbered 8-1 for an hour and a half of sustained combat. He noted that he had run out of ammunition after his 9th kill and had been forced to disengage. He sounded, in the clipped language of his report, vaguely annoyed about the ammunition situation. 9 kills in a single mission. 7 kills 3 months earlier, also in a single mission. 2 ace-in-a-day performances in 1 year of combat. David McCampbell would finish the war as the United States Navy's all-time leading ace with 34 confirmed aerial victories, and he would receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross for actions conducted largely from the cockpit of a machine his opponents had dismissed as an overweight failure. The collapse after Leyte Gulf was not merely tactical, it was psychological. Admiral Ozawa, who had committed Japan's remaining carrier aviation to Operation Igo and watched it destroyed over the Philippine Sea, wrote in his after-action report that the enemy's radar-guided fighter direction had achieved something he believed impossible. It had industrialized air combat. Each Hellcat, he wrote, was not an individual fighter, but a component in a vast machine. Japanese pilots, regardless of their individual skill, were not engaging other pilots. They were engaging a system, and systems could not be outdueled. Japanese military psychologists analyzing the mental state of surviving combat pilots after the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf developed a clinical term for what they were observing: Hellcat psychosis. It described a progressive deterioration in the combat effectiveness of pilots who had survived multiple encounters with Hellcats. Not physical cowardice, something more fundamental, a deep instilled certainty that the tactical options available to them were insufficient, that the gap between what they could do and what the enemy could do had grown too wide to bridge. That flying into combat against Hellcats wasn't really combat at all. It was just a different, slightly slower method of dying. The numbers driving that psychosis were real. By early 1945, Japanese naval pilot training had been reduced to 40 to 50 flight hours. Army pilots were receiving 60 to 70 hours. Kamikaze pilots, the suicide attack units that were now Japan's primary offensive aviation strategy, received approximately 40 to 50 hours of total training before their single mission. 40 hours, approximately 7 days of instruction. Men who had never successfully landed on a carrier, never fired their weapons in actual aerial combat, never flown at night or through weather, were being loaded into aircraft filled with explosives and told that their deaths would mean something. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the architect of the kamikaze program, calculated that if a Zero attacked a carrier conventionally, the probability of success was near zero, because the Hellcats would destroy it on the approach. If the Zero became a bomb, became a vehicle for the pilot's death rather than his skill, the probability of actually hitting something increased to roughly 30%. The pilot died either way, but as a kamikaze, his death had a 30% chance of meaning something.
The samurai tradition had been reduced to a probability calculation. The warrior philosophy that had produced Hiroyoshi Nishizawa and Saburo Sakai and the extraordinary pilots of 1941 had been transformed into a mathematics of desperation. And even the kamikazes, even the desperate sacrifice of men with 40 hours of training flying aircraft packed with explosives, were being intercepted by Hellcats before they reached their targets. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, leading his famous Flying Circus Division during the Okinawa campaign, shot down 23 Japanese aircraft in the spring of 1945 alone. His tactical innovations, coordinated 4 aircraft formations that he called the mowing machine, transformed Hellcat doctrine into something even more lethal than what McCampbell had been doing. 4 fighters in line abreast, separated by 100 yards, sweeping through Japanese formations at high speed, with each pilot covering his sector in an overlapping field of fire that left no escape route. 1 pass, zoom climb, reset, repeat. Valencia described it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man describing a manufacturing process, because that is what it had become. At Okinawa, Hellcats flew 38,038 combat sorties. They claimed 2,351 aerial victories against 249 losses. A 9.5-to-1 kill ratio sustained over months of the most intense aerial combat of the Pacific War. More significantly, they intercepted and destroyed approximately 80% of the kamikaze aircraft that attempted to reach the American fleet. The desperate final weapon that Japan had built from the wreckage of its aviation had been blunted, contained, and managed by the same aircraft that had destroyed conventional Japanese air power. By the summer of 1945, the technological gap had become so vast that it barely qualified as a competition. The final production variant of the Hellcat, the F6F incorporated water injection that pushed engine output to 2,200 horsepower. It carried zero-length rocket launchers capable of devastating ground targets. The K-14 computing gun sight automatically calculated deflection angles, taking one more variable out of the equation, making it easier for even relatively inexperienced American pilots to score hits on maneuvering targets. Saburo Sakai, Japan's surviving legend, the man who had flown through a hail of defensive fire with half his face destroyed and one eye gone, and still navigated hundreds of miles back to base on sheer will alone, encountered Hellcats for the first time in June 1944. He was flying with an almost mystical reputation, with all the skill accumulated over 200 combats and the desperate fire of a man who had already been to the edge of death and come back. He performed his best aerobatics, every maneuver he had perfected, loops, rolls, split-S brakes, every deception in the repertoire. He wrote afterward that the Hellcat followed easily, almost casually. He survived only because the American pilot had forgotten to jettison his drop tank before engaging, a mechanical mistake that degraded his performance just enough. A single forgotten switch in a pre-flight checklist saved Japan's greatest living ace. That is the distance the Hellcat had traveled from the aircraft that Japanese pilots had laughed at 18 months earlier. It had become something that only mechanical error could escape. On October 25, 1944, one day after McCampbell's record-setting engagement at Leyte Gulf, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa flew escort for the first official kamikaze mission in history, led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki. On that final escort, Nishizawa added his 86th and 87th confirmed kills to his record, shooting down 2 F6F Hellcats. It was the most he had ever faced and the finest display of his extraordinary talent. Japan's greatest ace at the absolute peak of his abilities on the most significant day of his career. The next day, October 26, 1944, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa boarded a transport aircraft as a passenger. He was unarmed, in a plane never designed for combat, unable to demonstrate the skills that had made him a legend. Hellcats from VF-14 found the transport and shot it down. Japan's greatest aviator of the entire war died without ever getting the chance to fight back, not in aerial combat, not in a duel, as cargo. That is the summary of what the Hellcat had done to Japanese aviation. Even its finest warrior, at the height of his powers the day before, survived only as long as he was in a cockpit. The moment he stepped out, the moment he became an ordinary human being in an ordinary aircraft, the system found him and killed him. By the final accounting, the F6F Hellcat had destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, while losing 270 to enemy fighters, 19.3 to 1. It had produced 305 United States Navy aces. It had accounted for 75% of all Navy air-to-air victories in the Pacific War. Against those numbers stood the remnant of what had once been the finest naval aviation force in the world. Of the 18,000 naval aviators who had gone to war with such confidence in December 1941, fewer than 100 combat-experienced pilots remained alive and capable of flying in August 1945. Fewer than 100, from 18,000. At Atsugi Airfield on August 25, 1945, Captain Minoru Genda, the man who had planned Pearl Harbor and dismissed the Hellcat as a fat American mistake, listened to Emperor Hirohito's recorded voice announce Japan's surrender over a crackling radio. Around him sat the remnants of the force he had helped build. Teenage pilots, 40 hours of flight time, aircraft assembled from cannibalized spare parts because the factories had nothing left to send. Empty fuel tanks. The
The first American aircraft to land at Atsugi after the surrender ceremony were 12 F6F Hellcats from USS Yorktown. Japanese pilots, mechanics, and ground crew who had spent years fighting and dying against this aircraft lined the runway to see it for the first time up close, to finally put their hands on the thing that had destroyed them. Lieutenant Robert Vasu, himself an ace with 19 kills, walked them around his aircraft and demonstrated its capabilities. The casual loops and rolls he performed, ordinary training maneuvers that would have destroyed a Zero structure through sheer G-force, left the gathered Japanese pilots speechless. He told them through an interpreter that he wasn't even pushing it, that in combat with water injection it was 20% more powerful, that the airframe was stressed to 13 Gs, and that he had never managed to break one. Never managed to break one. Japanese engineers studying captured Hellcats in the occupation period discovered something that crystallized the entire story. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine contained 2,840 precision-machined parts. Every single one of them was interchangeable with every other R2800 ever built. Any engine could be swapped into any airframe. Any part could replace any broken component. The standardization was so complete that a mechanic trained on one Hellcat could service any Hellcat anywhere in the world without additional instruction.
The Nakajima Sakai engine in the Zero required hand-fitting of components. No two engines were exactly alike. Every repair was a custom job. Every replacement was an approximation. The Zero had been built like a sword, crafted by artisans, unique and extraordinary and irreplaceable in ways that had seemed like virtues in 1941 and had become catastrophic liabilities by 1944. Jiro Horikoshi, the brilliant engineer who had designed the Zero and poured his life's work into it, studied the Hellcat extensively after the war. His conclusion was measured, honest, and devastating. He said that Japan had designed an aircraft for 1941. America had designed an aircraft system for 1945. While Japan was perfecting the sword, America was building the industrial age. In 1962, 17 years after the guns went silent, American and Japanese veterans gathered at a United States Navy symposium on Pacific War aviation. Men who had spent years trying to kill each other sat in the same room and tried to explain what had happened with the distance that time provides. David McCampbell, the Navy's ace of aces, stated simply that the Hellcat had won the Pacific Air War, period. He did not elaborate because he felt no elaboration was required. Saburo Sakai, who had survived everything the Pacific War could throw at him through a combination of extraordinary skill and the particular luck that sometimes preserves extraordinary men for reasons that history never fully explains, sat across the room and gave the most honest answer of his long life. He said the Zero had been a superior fighter. He said the Hellcat had been a superior weapon system. He said Japan had never understood the difference until it was too late. He said Japan had brought swords to a gunfight and wondered why they lost. He was still alive in 2000 when a journalist asked him in his final interview to sum up the Hellcat in his own words. He thought about it. He had spent 55 years thinking about it. He said the Zero had made Japan a great naval power. He said the Hellcat had shown Japan it was never as great as it believed. He said Japan had thought it was samurai. The Hellcat had shown them they were just men with outdated weapons facing the future. And then he said the last thing, the most honest and most devastating thing. He said that every Japanese pilot who survived the war had survived because a Hellcat pilot chose to let them live. Let that sit for a moment. Every Japanese pilot who saw 1946, every man who came home, every man who held his children and lived to see his country rebuild from the ashes, they existed because at some specific moment in the air over the Pacific, an American pilot with 2,000 horsepower and 6 machine guns and radar and armor and training and the full industrial weight of the most powerful nation on Earth behind him had made a choice that left them breathing.
That is the Hellcat's final verdict, not the kill ratio, not the production numbers, not the battles or the records or the turkey shoots. The final verdict is that the Japanese aviators who started the war with such absolute certainty of their own superiority ended it existing at their enemy's discretion, alive because they were allowed to be alive, defeated so completely that even survival was a gift given, not earned. The F6F Hellcat entered service in 1943, weighing twice what the Zero weighed, carrying armor the Zero had sacrificed, powered by an engine the Japanese could not build and could not match, armed with firepower they could not equal, guided by radar they could not detect and could not replicate, flown by pilots trained to a standard Japan had abandoned because it no longer had the fuel or the time, produced in numbers so vast that the factories making it never stopped running, never slowed down, never ran out of materials or workers or the grinding, relentless will to build one more, and then one more after that, and then one more after that. Japanese pilots laughed at the Hellcat because they saw its weight as weakness, its size as clumsiness, its armor as the admission of a nation that didn't trust its own pilots. They had built a philosophy of aerial warfare around individual excellence, spiritual superiority, and the absolute certainty that skill would always triumph over mass. The Hellcat answered that philosophy with the only argument that matters in war. It proved that a nation willing to protect its warriors, train them systematically, equip them with coordinated technology, and produce their weapons in quantities that cannot be depleted will always, eventually, inevitably, destroy a nation that can only produce better warriors. Not because the warriors are insufficient. Japan's pilots in 1941 were extraordinary beyond any fair criticism, but because warriors are finite and systems are not. By August 1945, Japan had fewer than 100 combat-capable naval aviators left. The system was still producing Hellcats at 1 per hour. The math always wins. The Hellcat had the last laugh. It always did. If this story hit you as hard as it hits most people who really sit with it, leave a comment below. Tell me what moment made you stop and rewind. Tell me what part you're going to be thinking about tomorrow. Share this with someone who thinks they know the Pacific War, because I guarantee there are things in this story they have never heard before. And if you want more stories like this, stories where history is stranger and more devastating and more human than any fiction could ever be, hit subscribe, because we're just getting started.